question is the motion be agreed to. The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, what we've heard are two very weak speeches in the opposition. Very weak. The first thing is the Leader of the Opposition was flat out making the 15 minutes and was repeating himself throughout. And the Deputy Leader, well, I started to take notes and I got down to about 2 points on the first page. And that was the end of the substance of his speech. And the fact of the matter is, Mr Deputy Speaker, the opposition's gone nowhere on this matter. Today they've completely run out of puff and they've been shown for what they are, that is trying to besmirch the integrity of the Prime Minister on this issue when he's been the Prime Minister prepared to tax the income from gold mining companies. And the only problem the Prime Minister has had was his faulty recollection last week and the fact that he had to change the statement in Parliament. The substance of the allegations have been shown to have no substance at all. Shown to have no substance at all. But Dr Hewson said today, the Professor said that the Prime Minister had selectively misrepresented the Cabinet decisions of 1986. He said there was no reference to 3 years, that whilst Keating and Evans didn't want to take part in that position, in fact Evans and I announced it. He went on to say on the radio, he talked about the radio, there was no categoric, this is the radio interview in Perth, no categoric reference, he said. If you were re-elected, would you? And Hawke said no. Well, here's the question by Diana Warnock. If you are re-elected, will there be a gold tax? Answer no. I mean, but the claim is he should have then said, "Oh no, for the next 3 years." I mean, what a lot of codswallop! What a lot of codswallop! Because the Howard letter at that stage hadn't appeared. The Howard letter appeared 11 days after that. So the Prime Minister wasn't responding to any written commitment from the opposition at that time. He wasn't responding to the specific three-year commitment by Mr Howard at that time. And the notion that because he didn't refer to it in some way he's being tricky is, of course, just dishonesty. Simply that, just simply dishonesty. And then he goes on to say that Dr Hewson said...
Could I ask the Treasurer to refer to the Leader of the Opposition?
The Leader of the Opposition said until July 7, no public intention to restrict it to 3 years. And then he said, then it surprisingly emerged on July the 7th. Well, in terms of any written commitments, the 3-year issue has been a formula used by both parties on a number of occasions. We used it in 1983 and kept to it in relation to the capital gains tax. And we mentioned it in relation because after that we could have been defeated at a poll. There was a 1990 election, remember? If the public didn't like the 1988 gold taxing arrangements, they could have turfed us out in 1990, remember? But they didn't. That was the point of the 3 years, which you dishonestly know. Now, the thing is, then we had the other dishonest claim by the Leader of the Opposition that I said last week that the letter was insignificant, that I said that the issue was insignificant. What I said was, I was aware the letter was written. Whether the letter was written or not is insignificant because the point was made by the Prime Minister by me that we would not be legislating in the course of that Parliament. I said the letter would have only given written confirmation of the things that the Prime Minister and I had said orally to the industry. I mean, again, another attempt to take that word insignificant out of context. But the real questions are, Mr Speaker, in all this, why did you vote against the bills in 1988? That's the real question. Why did Mr Howard write the letter in the first place? What did Mr Howard want from Mr Bond when he saw him? And what did Mr Bond want from Mr Howard in the course of that exchange? And Dr Hewson says, the Leader of the Opposition said, I'm not on the block. He said, the Prime Minister, you're on the block. But the interesting thing is, you see, there's an article written by Peter Rees in the West Australia on the 14th of October 1989, which makes interesting reading, Mr Speaker. He says this: when the Hawke government announced its plan on May last year to tax gold from January 1, 1991, Mr Howard told his shadow cabinet there was no alternative but to go along with the policy. That night, Andrew Peacock, then Shadow Treasurer, took the same line on television. But by October last year, that is in 1988, new factors were at work and a process to reverse this commitment had begun, with the West Australian Liberal Party leading the way. In hindsight, it coincided with the emergence of the campaign against Mr Howard. In a speech in New York in early October last year, Mr Howard made it clear he supported the tax. A month later, as the internal pressure against the tax mounted, he became more equivocal, saying he did not have a closed mind on the matter. The strongly held views of the WA Liberals on the issue played a part in influencing Mr Peacock to reverse his decision. His submission opposing it was ultimately supported by the Shadow Cabinet. It left the coalition parties in the questionable position of opposing the government's tax while not having a policy on their own. And it went on to say, among the shadow ministers backing Andrew Peacock were Fred Chaney, Wilson Tuckey and Peter Shack, all of whom were to play crucial roles in organising the coup against Mr Howard in May. There are conflicting versions about the Shadow Cabinet debate on the gold tax which ensued, but one Liberal who was present says Senator Chaney made the point that everyone around the table had a distortion, in inverted commas, which suited them politically, and this was his. That everyone around the table had a distortion which suited them politically, and this was his. Senator Chaney denied this yesterday, but agreed. Now listen to this. Senator Chaney denied this yesterday, but agreed he would have said something about how, quote, everyone has items which are important to his constituency, and this is important to his. I mean, this is little goody two-shoes Fred Chaney. This is little unctuous Fred. Another Liberal said yesterday if Chaney and Peacock had taken the position late last year that they have now ultimately taken, it would have made things a lot easier for Mr Howard. No, I dare say so it would have. I mean, this shows you who running around. I mean, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to understand that all of Durac's statements were as a result of his visits up and down St George's Terrace and around the gold mining company. And the same would go for Shack and for Tuckey. The same would go also for Chaney, who's always presented himself as an upright, decent citizen after truth, justice and the Australian way. No, sit down and cop it. Sit and cop it. You can dish it out, sit and cop it.
You're not in charge of this place.
You're not in charge of this place.
You're not in charge.
Point of order.
You're not in charge of this place. We still have a Speaker who presides over the House.
No, I'll hear the member for Hume's point of order.
Mr Deputy Speaker, on a point of order. Mr Deputy Speaker, during the last week of sitting, you interrupted a speech by the Leader of the Opposition and asked him to refrain from naming members by their surname and to refer to their electorates. I would hope that you would impose the same ruling on the Deputy Prime Minister.
The member for Hume knows it. The member for Hume knows I've already done that today, and I'm sure the Treasurer understands that. The Honourable the Treasurer.
Terms by the use of their names. He wants them dismissed by the use of their electorate. Now, the fact is, Mr Speaker, it is these people moving around the gold mining industry in Western Australia that has produced this policy in the first place, but when, apparently, the then Leader of the Opposition, the member for Bennelong, wanted to, in fact, agree with the government and impose a tax on gold, he was upended by these West Australians and, of course, Senator Chaney, the then Senator Chaney, who, as I say, always masquerades as someone after truth, justice and the Australian way, and is actually in there supporting all this sort of tax rorting, which any other decent, upstanding person would be supporting the government against. Now, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, I said this in the House, and I said this earlier, and it's worth repeating again. There is no place for humbug in these debates, and when the member for Bennelong got up on the Prue Goward show and said the government does have an explanation to give, and the Prime Minister does, in terms of the 3-year thing, that was an indecent piece of humbug from him. And in the same program, Ms Goward said, well, how well funded was your party in West Australia by the gold industry? Howard, I wouldn't have a clue, he said. No, you know, silly and civil. Silly and civil. I mean, what you don't know doesn't hurt you, you know. But the fact is, we'd like to know what went on at this lunch with Bond, and the real issue is, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party's tax this industry now. It's now under taxation. The Liberal Party opposed it. Mr Howard wrote the letter saying he wouldn't do it for the 3 years of a Liberal government, and then his party knocked him over and went in there and opposed the taxation of gold mining income. Now, again, I think it's important that the West Australian Royal Commission asked Senators Durack and also the the member for Pearce, Mr Cheney, the member for Tangney, Mr Shack, and the member for O'Connell, Mr Tuckey, and the member for Bennelong and representatives of the Liberal Secretariat, why did the Liberal Party make its commitment on the non-taxation of gold? Why did they finally vote against the bills when they came to the House of Representatives? Which gold mining companies are interested Mr Howard and the other parties at the time in 1987 speak to? What commitments were sought by these interests, and what funds did these interests provide either directly or indirectly to the Liberal Party campaign to secure the Liberal Party's early and definitive opposition to the taxation of gold mining income? Now, they're the issues, Mr Speaker. I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you want to get up and make these cheap points, if you want to get up and make these cheap points, now the thing is, the member for Bennelong's over there having a little interject. Well, let me just tell him that Mr Speaker, I've had to get up and fight through the Australian community, through the Parliament, capital gains,
the member for Bennelong,
fringe benefits. That's it. That is taking away their tax-free meals, taxing fringe benefits, cars, subsidised loans and all the rest, the asset test, changing the tax treatment of lump sum super, gold mining, private company dividends, all of foreign source income, all of the rest of it, and you've made our lives a misery on every point. You've opposed everything, and you're still no, don't feel sorry for me, John. I don't need any of your things. But let me just tell you this. Don't try and get up with any sense of integrity and try and impugn us. I mean, don't feel sorry for us, but don't try and impugn us. From your murky position in Australian public life, don't try and impugn us. And Mr Speaker, this is. I mean, what sort of moral basis to our politics is there when the government, which has cleaned up the tax system, including for gold, is under attack, but the party which has been vociferous against those changes and supported every rort in the system can stand in the House of Representatives and ask questions of the government as though they're on some moral ground? They have no shame. That's right. They have no shame, and that's the position. So the point is, the Western Australian Royal Commission ought to get busy with the Western Australian Liberals and get them before the Western Australian and ask them these questions. Ask them these questions. It is very interesting, isn't it, that we actually got a written undertaking from the Liberal Party that they wouldn't impose a tax on gold. Interesting. And we have these vociferous press statements by Senator Durack all of that time. Oh, of course, he's never run into a gold miner in St George's Terrace. He doesn't know any of the gold mining companies. He's never had any conversations with them. They've never asked the gold mining industry for funds. Pigs. Of course you have. You're guilty, and you know it. And you're just now hoping like hell this commission doesn't get on the back of you. And because that's when it'll come out. I mean, you've been at it. All the ramps in the tax system existed in the first place because of your dishonour. And they've stayed there until we took them away in all of these deals you always made with these sections of industry. But, Mr Speaker, I'll conclude where I began. The Leader of the Opposition tried to make an issue out of it and made the most pedestrian of speeches. I mean, if ever there was a wooden, narrow, omnidimensional character, it's the Leader of the Opposition. He couldn't mount an attack if his life depended on it. He wouldn't go 2 rounds with a revolving door. And he's in here today trying to attack the integrity of somebody who's actually cleaned the tax system up. And he's joined by the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, whose contribution was even more pathetic than his usual contributions on MPIs and everything else, without even laying a glove on. I mean, I thought, oh well, at least now he's up. There'll be a bit of dirt here. I'll get the note out. Nothing. He couldn't even manage that. I mean, it was just the innuendo, snide references from a group of empty individuals who've tried to say the Prime Minister's country lacks integrity, and you haven't made a single solitary point of substance. The only point you got was that, with a question without notice, the Prime Minister couldn't remember the events precisely and had to come in last week and correct himself. That is the sum total of it. End of section, finished. That's the long and short of it. You haven't laid a glove on us, and nor you should, because you're the people who basically corrupted the tax system, and you're now even saying you would return it to its corruption by removing gold, capital gains and all the other rorts for which you were completely famous. And all of you, including your little clever friend, the member for Bennelong, and all of the others for you, stand guilty as you've always been, with Durack and the rest of their ilk for corrupting the revenue base of the Commonwealth of Australia, and that is the issue in Australian politics.